I am really, really glad to bring to you Jim Fletcher today, a friend I've known for a number of years. We're going to be taking a trip to Israel, actually, October of this year, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's a whole bunch of things that we want to discuss here, really when it pertains to Israel, and not only the historical and the ancient of it, but the modern of it as well, which will play in a bit to our trip in October. So, want to welcome you, Jim. It's good to see you, and I'm glad that you're here to join us.
Good to see you as well.
Well, we've been talking a lot. You're one of the people that I love to go to on this, and uh, I don't know if this probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but you and I became friends and got to know one another through a mutual friend of ours, a guy named Matt Buff, who brought you on to a program on Rapture Ready, and we wanted actually Matt was able to make contact with you about a segment that we always did looking at Israel and what was going on there. That's got to be what, 10 years ago?
No, it's 15.
Is it that far back? Are you serious?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Well, anyway, we looked at Israel at the time, and man, if we could have said, fast forward to 2025, I don't think either you or I could have imagined the world in which we live currently. And when it comes to not only the church, but the United States and to Israel.
Yeah. I totally agree. And that's a good point. Nobody that follows this stuff closely even could say, yeah, I kind of saw it going this direction,
Yeah,
especially last week.
seriously, this last week has been really interesting, and this is why you and I had decided it would probably be a good idea to go through this and to look at a few different things. But of course, everybody's kind of on pins and needles about what's going to be happening in Gaza, and news just broke within the last 15 minutes that I think is really significant that we'll eventually get into. But I don't think that we have the ability to even begin to understand what's happening in the current world if we don't understand what's happened in the ancient world. So I think I'd like to kick this off by just, the people that have a real problem with Israel and the land right now. We need to discuss, what did God have to say when the nation as we know it was first really spoken of, where God had established it. And that history is 4,000 years old, going back to the time of Abraham.
Well, the what is called the title deed to the land goes back to Genesis, and even that's debated. I mean, there's kind of two schools of thought. There's the people that just think the Bible is myth anyway, so it doesn't hold any water with them. But then there's others who say, well, yeah, but the land that was promised to Abram's descendants would have to include the Arabs of today, came through Ishmael. No, the Bible says that Isaac is the child of the promise. Isaac that became Israel, the Jewish people. And so scripturally, there's no question whatsoever that land belongs to the Jewish people. And of course, in Genesis there early on, it has a long view of prophecy, in that at the very end, the land will encompass most of the Middle East. I mean, from the river in Egypt all the way to the Persian Gulf, people don't realize that this sliver of land, Israel today, that you see on a map, is a small portion of what is really theirs. But the middle of the country today, the mountain range running north south, is the mountains of Israel in Scripture, which would include what is called today the West Bank. We know it as Judea, Samaria. So that has always been in force. There's the covenant that God established with Abraham was unconditional. Man had nothing to do with it. Abraham had nothing to do with it. It was instituted by God himself. So it's unbreakable. And which brings us up to the present moment. I'm always surprised at people who try to explain away the return of the Jewish people from exile. You can't do it. And so it's crystal clear the Bible prophesied many times. I think there's 1,000 prophecies in the Bible that talk about the land and the return to the land after long exile. Um, 2,000 years, 1,900 years went by, and all of a sudden, the late 19th century, they start coming back in mass. 1948, the state of Israel is established. They're there. It's the biggest prophecy fulfillment in 2,000 years, just staring us in the face, and most people aren't aware of it. And we've talked about this many times. The sad thing is, most people in the church aren't aware of it.
Right.
But that's where it is. And even legally in the modern age, Israel has a right to the land. The United Nations, the partition vote in 1947 was supposed to establish an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Jews took the deal. The Palestinian Arabs that they would become, said no. They've always said no, and have presented themselves as perpetual victims.
And there it is, from ancient history to modern history. The interesting thing about it is that the land itself is something that we can always know, the borders of it, that they actually settled as opposed to what was promised to them. And if people want to look it up, the promise of the land and the dimensions of it are covered in Genesis 15. I think it's around verse 18 is where that starts. But he talks about the river, the Euphrates, all the way to the Nile, and then in between. And the headwaters of the Euphrates are up at where Syria and Turkey meet, up there in the Mediterranean. So it's an enormous territory that was never actually taken. But there is a huge portion of the church that is stuck in what we call replacement theology, or what's known as replacement theology. And they don't understand, and they can't distinguish the difference between the promise that's made to the church and to humanity in general versus the promise that's made about the territory and the genealogy of those who come from Abraham. So, for lack of time, not wanting to take too much time on it, we got a lot of topics to get to. If people want to look at that, the promise to the nations is found in Genesis 12, and that's where God says that through you I'll bless the nations. And that would of course imply a messianic figure that would come from his direct lineage. So Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to Judah, and the generations from his son Judah comes Jesus. He's of the tribe of Judah. So that's to the church, that's to the whosoevers. And when we get to chapters 15, 16, and 17, for those who really want to know this, 15 is where he gives them the promise, and they go ahead of God on that. Ishmael is born, and that's what we get in chapter 16, the intrigue from that, because they didn't check in with God and see what his plan was. Chapter 17, Ishmael's born before Isaac, and he says, let Ishmael walk before you, and God clearly says to him, no. So the promise that he's made is not only for the territory, which he defines the borders of it, but also a genealogy that has to come through Isaac and not through Ishmael. And the promise that is one that's forever is reaffirmed through the sons. It's reaffirmed through Jeremiah and other places that God would reestablish Israel and Judah back in the land again. And that never happened from the time that Jeremiah wrote it until modern times, or that of Amos as well, chapter 9, 14 and 15, where God talks about that I'm going to bring them into the land at that last time, and they'll never be displaced again. So they've always had these times of displacement, but I believe that what we're looking at now is the fulfillment of all of those promises. So that really establishes the ancient promise to Israel. God said it was forever, it was a territory, and it was a people genealogically, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the church. But that doesn't stop the replacement theology people, which you're constantly contending with.
Yeah, replacement theology is a problem. I remember 20 years ago or more, I was at a conference in Fort Worth, your hometown, and one of the speakers called replacement theology a scourge in the church. And he was very correct. Now, about in the last 5 or 6 years, replacement theology has backpedaled a bit. And I think the reason is what we've talked about. It's very obvious the Jewish nature of Scripture. The Bible is Jewish. It was recorded by Jews. It's about a Jew. A Jew is the Redeemer's, the Messiah. And so also, as people can see what we've been talking about, that the Jews have indeed come back, and you can't explain away the fulfillment of that gigantic prophecy. The replacement guys, as I would put it, have kind of backed off, and they don't like using the term replacement theology because their strategy is identical to the propagandists in Washington. They manipulate language, they manipulate words, and so they espouse the same thing, but they then change it to another term. But anyway, replacement theology is kind of not fallen out of favor, maybe, but I would say that they can't really substantiate their claims. The return of the Jews from exile, the ingathering, it's too big. It's too big to rig, and so
Exactly.
they can't get away from that.
It is something that, again, there are very few people that I could pick up the phone with and who have the same view of all this stuff that you do. So whenever you and I get a chance to talk on these matters, it's like getting a chance to be in an echo chamber, though we don't have to compare notes. It's just the way that we read the things happening in the world because we really know what the ultimate outcome is going to be. And I feel so passionately about this. You and I were at a conference and we talked about this very same topic. Who has the rights to the land? And really, it was even answering how do you deal with the people that are into replacement theology, and their sandbox for that is Galatians 3. But that can be easily dismantled if we just carefully read through the text in light of what the scriptures had to say. So it's an interesting thing, and sometimes we don't really pay a lot of attention to this. Can you imagine being somebody, say, coming out of the Reformation, when people were able to once again have license, if you will, to begin to read the scripture for themselves, and they come across all of these prophecies about God making an everlasting covenant with the nation through Abraham and his descendants, direct descendants of Isaac, or then through Isaac and then through Jacob, and all of that had to go by a very specific line. And then thinking, but they've been displaced from the land for 1,500 years. What would you end up coming to a conclusion? Maybe we didn't understand this correctly, or maybe we just don't understand God's timetable, but he was far too precise for this to be spiritualized. It's clearly speaking about a literal fulfillment that he would have to bring them into the land eventually, no matter how improbable it must have seemed.
Well, when you can't refute it, when you can't refute what scripture says, then you're left with what's really anymore the only answer I hear people give that don't want to accept the return has been fulfilled is that it was just the Jews being back in the land is just a coincidence of history.
Right.
Just a coincidence. I mean, I remember years ago, and I don't mind saying the name, Zondervan published a study Bible. And I believe it was in the section of Ezekiel 37, which clearly talks about the physical return of the Jews to the land and then their spiritual transformation. They had about 3 options that you could choose to explain this. And one of them, in essence, was it's just a coincidence. Well, that's the most absurd answer I can imagine.
And that's actually one of my favorite places for us to visit when we're in Israel, is to go to Masada. And in Masada, which most people don't know this, and I love to share it with the group when we're there, in Masada, when they began those excavations back in the 60s, they located where the synagogue would have been. And in looking through what was there, they noticed a floor that had a void underneath it. And in that void was the dry bones passage from Ezekiel. And the only other Bible passage that they found in the synagogue was the passage from Deuteronomy where God shows Moses the land, but then he can't go in. And I think that was deliberately put there by God, thousands of years ago for the very express purpose of this. Moses sees the land that God had promised to them, but they would be displaced. And Masada is like the perfect example of that displacement. And yet God preserved for them and for all of us Ezekiel 37 about the dry bones and them coming back to life. which is really kind of the reestablishment of the nation. So I love sharing that when we're in Israel. It's one thing that we'll do when we're at Masada, when we get a chance to, after touring it, to tell that truth. A lot of churches and even people who tour there often don't even know that story.
Mhm. Yeah, in fact, I've talked to people that have taken tours to the Holy Land. I grew up in the probably the heyday of the evangelical churches, and that was what everybody wanted to do. But I'm surprised often when I ask people, about their trip and the teaching and things, they don't understand a tenth of what they should have come away with. And believe it or not, I have talked to people before who have done that who don't realize that Jesus is a Jew.
Yeah, yeah,
So your tours are a godsend, but yes, that kind of detail and that kind of historical reality, it's very hard for the other side to refute.
yeah. Well, how can you? I mean, you're standing right there where all that stuff took place, and then what God has put there, kind of as a way of saying, "Well, wait until they find this,"
Yeah.
which just it's such a blessing to be able to be a part of it. So, let's fast forward to what is kind of more modern times, middle of last century. We're going to be going on our very first day of touring. We have three things on our schedule. And the first one is the ancient city of Joppa, most of which has been covered over. So there's not a lot in the way of archaeology, but we know that Joppa is a city that had been in operation as a port city for thousands of years, back before even the time of Abraham. So a 5,000-year-old city, roughly. And but the same day, we go to two other places: the Haganah Museum, and then also what is their version of what we would think of as Independence Hall that we have in Philadelphia with the Liberty Bell. They have the exact same thing. So why don't you, if you could, just tell us a little bit about those days and the importance of the modern versus the ancient?
Yeah. Um, well, first with the port there at Jaffa, it's amazing. You can stand in the exact spot where Jonah sailed to try and avoid his mandate to go to Nineveh. The place is still there. I mean, they've kind of built a boardwalk there now and
Right.
things, but this was his departure point. And then uh, you mentioned Independence Hall. It's interesting to me too that again, if I'm talking to people that have been on tours, Independence Hall is not on most itineraries, and I've always been blown away by that. It is the building where the modern state of Israel was established in May of 1948, where David Ben-Gurion read over international radio the Declaration of the State. He read it from a scroll written in Hebrew, and the scroll is there today. And so the building itself, very nondescript building from the outside. You would have no idea what it just looks like an office building. In fact, the first time I visited there, I was just on my own, and I'm walking down the street, and I knew it was there close by. And I asked three or four Israelis, they didn't know what I was talking about. But I found it. I walk in the door, and it's like you're walking back into 1948. Everything is exactly the same as it was that day. I sat in Golda Meir's chair. The dais is there where they all sat. It's an amazing, amazing place, and it is a direct fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah 66, can a nation be born in a day? It was established in one day, and it's a stone's throw from the beach, and it's there. It's a must see on a tour. And then kind of outside catty corner from it, I think on the same street is the Haganah Museum, which is an even more obscure location for tourists, but it is an absolute must if you want to understand the beginnings of the Israel Defense Forces. It is the headquarters of the Haganah, which was the pre-state quasi-military group forming what would become the IDF. Another amazing, amazing place. You'll learn what it was like for the Jews in Palestine pre-state to survive terror attacks, because the Arabs have been attacking them since at least the late 19th century, and so that's there. It's a must see.
And this is the reason why we added that one extra day to our tour. Our tour is normally 10 days. And if anybody's ever been there, if you're going to take some time on any given day to go through any place in Tel Aviv and Jaffa in the same day, you're not going to get to anything else for the rest of the day. There's so much life there. There's so much traffic. There's so much going on. The only way to do that is to go one extra day. So we have one full day. That's how we begin our trip. And really, it kind of sets in motion everything that you're going to see going forward, because most everything that we will look at is going to be very much of the ancient. We do see latrine, which is given to, it's a memorial for all of those that they've lost in tank battles. And so we do get to that, but most of the history that we see is ancient, either 2,000 years or all the way back to Abraham, or in the case of Joppa, even further back than that. So we see these really ancient places, but those ancient places would not have the same significance if God had not brought them back into the land. It's almost insignificant at that point, because then if they weren't there in the land now, it wouldn't be fulfilled prophecy, and we wouldn't really have a lot to talk about. So that's why we felt that it was really good to add that extra day and give people a real appreciation for it. One of the things that we do on the bus every single morning, we begin, as all tours do, most all tours, they will have somebody pray for the day. And keep us safe. Let us take in all of these things. Speak to us through your word. All those kind of things. A good way to start the day in prayer. We do the additional part is that we will read something from the Old Testament of a prophecy where God said that he would regather the people. And that's read on the bus, so that it's just like, let's have a reminder that everything that you'll see with your eyes is an answer to God's prophecy of saying, this is what I will do in those latter days. And the establishment of Israel is right up at the very top of that. So since we talked about Haganah and we talked about Independence Hall, let's move on to what took place actually in 48. Ben-Gurion read what you were mentioning. Interestingly enough, he kind of was more on the secular side of things and did recognize the importance of what the scripture had to say of them becoming a nation. But why don't you run us through the armistice of 47 and what actually happened in 48? And the wars and all those kind of things, because they really are pertinent to our discussion today of things that are happening right now.
Yeah. So in November of 47, the United Nations voted in the partition plan, which was to divide historic Palestine into two states, Arab and Jewish. And most people don't realize that they think that the Jews took land from the Palestinians. It was actually the reverse. Historic Palestine included today's present borders of Israel and Jordan, the neighboring country just to the east. That was all Palestine. The British in 1917 had promised that territory to a Jewish state. 30 years go by. They had too much anti-Semitism had come into the government, and they were much more predisposed to the Arabs. So Israel was given about a third of historic Palestine. The rest was given to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. People don't realize that the modern Middle Eastern countries, the Arab states, are barely older than modern Israel. The Allied powers simply created borders. I mean, Iraq, Jordan, all those countries, they're 80 years old. I mean, it was all before that, just Mesopotamia for 5,000 years. And so the Jews realized this was their historic opportunity. And so they took the deal. And the Arabs, of course, did not. Now, Jordan was created, but the Arabs that were within part of the territory were sort of, they're the ones that didn't want to take what would have been half of modern Israel today. And so that's where you get the quote displacement, the refugee situation. And so by the following spring, the Jewish leadership in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion and his advisors, they realized that if they didn't go ahead and announce statehood, they may have missed an historic window, and they would have. And so they decided May 14th is going to be the day, and we're going to do it in Tel Aviv. 5 Arab nations around them said, if you do this, we're going to attack you. And they did. The day after Israel's established, 5 Arab armies invaded. They had overwhelming superiority over the Jews. And guess who won? The Jews. Why? Because scripture says, as you mentioned earlier, Amos 9:15, God said, when I bring you back for a final time, you will never be uprooted again. If you were paying attention at the time as a Bible believer, you wouldn't have worried that Israel would lose the war, and they didn't.
Right.
And so that then starts decades of cross-border raids and terror attacks, and sometimes whole countries in 67 and 73.
Right.
The Egyptians, the Syrians, they all invade them again, couldn't defeat them on the battlefield. And so here's a little exercise. If you go back into newspaper microfilm records after the 1967 Six-Day War, you begin to hear about Palestinians. Okay? Prior to that, they're part of the pan-Arab nation. They're just Arabs, like the Jordanians, the Saudis, all of them. It's the same family. The Palestinians were created as a political weapon against Israel, which has been far more successful than any of their battlefield. They lose every time on the battlefield, but politically, because there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, the Arabs have a leg up there.
See, and if you want to go the next step with that, that's where we get Yasser Arafat. He becomes the face of the, quote, Palestinians, which is just a fabrication of modern history. A group of people known by something else, they give them a label and they put somebody as their representative who's just an avowed terrorist.
But by the way, the modern argument is that it's all about Israel stealing Arab land, and they wouldn't, that most people don't know. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was created in 1964 by representatives from Egypt. It was actually formed in a hotel on the Mount of Olives, the Seven Arches Hotel. 4 years later, Arafat was named chairman.
Right.
And Arafat is one of the great serial killers in all of history. He was nothing more than a thug terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
But he engaged in terrorism for a couple of decades, and then the Western powers, and this is one of the weaknesses of the West, they will pull their enemy out of the fire at the last minute and boost them. And so by the early 90s, the George H.W. Bush administration, his foreign policy team was a complete disaster in every way. They pulled Arafat out of a cave in Tunisia where he was hiding out in exile, put a suit on him, and invited him to the White House and created the two-state solution model, which has been a total disaster for 30 years. And so all they did was kick the can down the road and create more and more tension and violence, including the Arab people have been killed because of the policies of their leadership.
And so then they try to legitimize him and make him a normal person, though he always shows up almost looking like Fidel Castro with a keffiyeh. That's pretty much what he is. So
that's not that's a very good comparison, because Arafat was schooled by the communists on how to wage revolution. They said, look, this murdering children in school buses is not winning you any PR points. You need to shift your focus and now become a statesman, and you're fighting for your people, for statehood. Arafat never wanted a state. He turned it down at least twice from the Israelis. So historically bad character, but the West just fell in love with the guy.
Interestingly enough, even with that, there were still enough people who really realized for him for who he was. And of course, he dies, and then the person that they put in his place doesn't try to put on the same military kind of motif. Instead, you get a guy like Mahmoud Abbas, who's really just Arafat in a three-piece suit.
Abbas is an Olympic level grifter. That's all he cares about. Right. He's wealthy beyond measure. He was a Holocaust, his PhD was in Holocaust denial. And he's hated Jews from the moment he started breathing. and is it, so when he was, quote, elected as chairman of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, that was 20 years ago. They haven't had an election since.
Right.
He's he's got mansions and Swiss bank accounts. He's been living off the gravy train for 20 years, but has never changed his spots. He still is a Jew hater.
And see, this is an important thing that people should realize because of what's happening there in Gaza. It's the same thing with all the leaders of Hamas. How do the top four guys all become billionaires like Abbas without anybody really necessarily knowing it? And nothing is produced in Gaza or in Judea Samaria under the Palestinian Authority. That's all money that comes from other sources, and they're skimming it, grifting it. Of course, saying you need to help our people, but their people live in squalor. It's one of the things that I like, being able to drive through Bethlehem, which we may or may not be able to do in October. We'll just have to see. But I tell people, take out your phones and take pictures of this. Take a picture of that mansion that's sitting right next to what's a shanty kind of lean-to kind of thing, and ask yourself a question. Who lives in one and who lives in the other, and who do they know? And you'll understand why it is that they live in that kind of opulence, because they're not making it by being businessmen in the West Bank or in Gaza. So it's all foreign money that's just skimmed. It is just, as you say, a grift, nothing more, nothing less, which really kind of helps, I think, set the table for what we really wanted to get to today. And that's the things that have happened in modern times. And let's go ahead and fast forward it to the events of October the 7th, because that happened under Biden's watch. And now things are looking a lot different, at least if nothing else, in the public discourse now that Trump is in office. So let's go back and let's go through the October 7th of 2023. What did foreign policy have to play in that, and what took place, and where did it all go wrong?
Well, it was a coming together of events that really were catastrophic for Israel. The U.S. administration, which I don't have a problem saying was illegitimate for 4 years, it just so happened the weakest administration probably since Millard Fillmore, back in the 19th century. Just not effective, but also corrupt and morally bankrupt. You're talking about, in the best of times, leadership in Washington is not biblical. I can't think of a U.S. president that thinks about the Arab-Israeli conflict in a biblical way. They may throw a sop to, Christian Zionists here and there for votes. They don't really believe it. And so, Putin invades Ukraine. Well, that's a big signal to the other bad guys around the world. The U.S. did nothing. Biden said don't, embarrassingly, and then he does.
Yeah.
So we're not going to do anything about it. Well, Hamas doesn't need a bigger green light than that. And there's some reports that they were coordinating a joint attack with Hezbollah in the north, but Hamas jumped the gun. And I think that's probably true. I think Sinwar, who was the leader in Gaza, he went ahead, and on the Saturday morning, October 7th, thousands of Gazans came across the border in southern Israel. The initial reports were it was maybe 1,500 Hamas terrorists. No, it was more like 6,000 terrorists and Gazan citizens came across. They waged what is called a pogrom, Pogrom. Pogroms have been waged since the beginning of history. It is violence against a Jewish community. And so they were in a frenzy. They come across the border, they bulldozed down fences, and they were in Israeli communities around Gaza within minutes. And they did things to the Israelis there that are unspeakable. The violence that was done, murder, rape, burning people alive, all these things. And so they were there. They pulled out 250 hostages and went back deep into Gaza before anybody could react. Again, largely because of the weakness of the U.S. administration, it was inevitable that it was going to go the way it's gone. It was going to be a long, protracted war. The Israeli chief of general staff said immediately, he said, this is a year-long war. I think they understood what they were facing with the hostage situation from the first minutes that the reports came in. So one of the stains on human history, and one of the biggest stains on American history, is the ineffectiveness of U.S. leadership during this. Biden, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, his national security team, they lengthened the suffering of the Israeli hostages because of their stupid policies. They were soft on Hamas. They put pressure on Israel, I mean, and I think that aside from that, if you look at some of the prophecies in the 2 Timothy chapter 3, you see a laundry list of really terrible characteristics people will have in the last days. One of them is a lack of love, a lack of empathy. And today there's such a thing as the villain becomes the victim and vice versa.
Yeah.
And Israel is the classic victim that is presented as the villain in the world. They had no choice but to go in and wage war against Hamas in a densely populated suburban environment. 1.7 million Arabs, urban fighting, house to house, everything's booby trapped. It was an existential war, meaning if you lose this war, you disappear, you die.
Right.
The national life dies. Israel had no choice but to go in, but all of it lasted probably 8 to 10 months longer because of the unconscionable actions of Biden. And he wasn't quite as far gone as some people think. He always touted his friendship with Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi is my buddy and all that kind of thing. Biden is a Jew hater from way back. He never liked Israel. He liked touting his relationships like that because it made him seem statesmanlike.
Yeah.
He's the most mediocre politician in modern American history, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
So American weakness enabled Hamas to create suffering that we haven't heard in generations. Right. If you read ancient history and antiquity, conquering armies like the Assyrians were the cruelest. They were doing things that the Hamas is doing now. I mean, cutting off people's body parts while they're alive and burning them alive, putting their heads on stakes. I mean, that's what Hamas is. And that's what the Gazan population is, which brings us up to what I know we're going to talk about is I think Trump doesn't really embrace this stuff biblically, but he can read a room and he knows exactly what Hamas is. And he knows it's folly to continue trying to negotiate with these people.
Perfectly said. And I think if people really want to do a little bit of go back and look at history, you mentioned a few people, or you mentioned the Biden administration. Blinken was one that you had mentioned, and of course, Biden himself. But one of the guys that people don't really necessarily know is Sullivan, Jake Sullivan. And if you go back and look at what he said, it was kind of like, I don't know, around the 20th, somewhere about of September, like only 2 to 3 weeks before October. He was talking about how wonderfully they've done and that the Middle East is more peaceful than it's been in a couple of decades, is the way he put it. And you could say one of two things. If there was a muscular foreign policy that we had in place, you could take credit for it. Or it may very well be that they were so asleep at the switch that it allowed, nobody's going to make any noise if you're Hamas, Hezbollah, all the rest of them. If you've got an administration here that's looking the other way on everything, you keep your head down, stay quiet, but you're making your preparations because you really want an administration like that if you're going to try to pull this off. One of the other things that people don't realize, they think that Hezbollah got involved in it much later because Israel didn't turn their attention to the north until they had cleaned up some things in the south. But Hezbollah started in the following day and consistently from that point on. So Israel was having to fight a literal two-front war, north and south. And most people don't even realize that. But again, the administration here never put the kind of pressure on those countries that they could have to silence and stop all that. And if people think we can only do so much, take a look at what's happened around our country in the last 3 months with foreign nations when they know that the president says something, and when he makes a threat, he'll follow through with it, and they know, and they come to heel. Now, people may not like that, but that's just the way that it is. So we've had a real obvious difference between the last administration and this one. They could have brought this to a halt so much quicker. But of course, they're just not they weren't engaged, they didn't care, and they were completely feckless at their jobs because their worldview is completely different. They don't see power.
Well, the people we're talking about in Washington, they and Hamas, it's all the same community. It's all a globalist drifting operation. It's all the same thing. They're creating chaos and misery for the people while enriching themselves. The aid money that's flowed into Gaza for decades, it's coming back to U.S. politicians, including in Congress. We're going to find out stuff that's going to make us sick.
Yeah.
And it's flowing to guys not just like Abbas in the PLO, but those Hamas fat cats. Those guys, they're some of them are billionaires.
Yeah.
And I just want to say
they
one
were.
more thing. Yeah, they were. I want to say one more thing about Jake Sullivan. Sullivan, was a holdover from the Obama years. Mm-hmm. Obama is an Israel hater from way back.
Yep.
And Jake Sullivan, see, these people are urbane, intellectual. They go to cocktail parties in Georgetown. Their foreign policy is profoundly stupid and ineffective. It doesn't exist in the real world. It exists in theory. It's all theoretical. And so now you have Trump and Netanyahu have to come in behind them and clean up the stupidity.
Right. So before we move on to the modern of things, let's go back and let's go into a little bit of what happened, what we saw happening around the church. We saw a real divide in the church when October the 7th happened. You had the people that would say, well, Israel had it coming, they're the usurpers. And then you had the other people that were saying, well, why are we surprised that Hamas did this and that they've been planning this? They haven't had any oversight for 20 years, aside from the UN, which just gave them cover. So let's address that if we could, because I don't know if people really fully understand how just demonic it was that the church would want to blame Israel and say they don't even have a right to be there. They're not in any way a supernatural work of God. They're just people that it's more coincidence. There's nothing prophetic about that.
Yeah. Well, interesting enough, about the time you and I met, so this is around 2010, I started, it took me a long time I was a little slow in the uptake. I started hearing kind of odd things coming from certain circles in the church about Israel. And I thought, what is this all about? Because, from the end of World War II to 2000, the mainline and Catholic churches were not good on Israel. Okay. They, for one thing, scripturally, they see all of that as allegory, spiritualized stuff. So they don't have that same worldview that the land belonged to the Jews, et cetera. So that was that. But then in the 2000s, I start hearing weird things come out of evangelical circles along those lines. There was a guy around that time who, believe it or not, came out of Pentecostal circles. He came out of the Assemblies of God. His name was Paul Alexander. He starts blogging about the Palestinian Jesus. And I'm like, what? In the late 90s, in Christianity Today magazine, Philip Yancey, the very popular evangelical writer everybody loves, really a great writer, his worldview is really off. He wrote about Jesus was a Palestinian rabbi. That's not true. Jesus was never a Palestinian. The apostles and Jesus never knew anything about Palestine. Palestine was named the region by the Romans a century after the apostles in the second century.
Right.
So you have this kind of stuff going on. And what I saw was that filtering out of the mainline liberal left wing view of Israel, that was now reaching the evangelical circles. And I've probably said some things not popular already, but I'm going to say this too. The evangelical leadership today has been compromised by the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
The Palestinians are very smart. They're not stupid. The leadership has been, as I said, they've been schooled by the right propagandists. And so a little bit similar to Arafat, it's like, well, the violence isn't working. And so you got to try something else, and you got to burrow into the group that you want to compromise. The Palestinians did that at the evangelicals. They've compromised a lot of the Southern Baptists. They've compromised the Assemblies of God. They went straight into the heart of the evangelical world. And you know what? From their standpoint, that was smart.
Sure.
If I were them, that would be my line of attack. Don't go to the main line. Those guys have been your buddies for 60 years.
Right.
Go straight into who is your enemy, which is the Bible-believing evangelical community, and you start pushing what is called the Palestinian narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And the Palestinian narrative is occupation by Israel bad, Palestinians innocent and good.
Right.
We need a two-state solution. We need blah, blah, blah. You even attack it theologically. You know, you get these guys creating a different reality. I'm going to tell you a quick story. This has been 25 years ago, but I became aware of a Palestinian theologian at Bethlehem Bible College. Okay. And so this guy, I'm reading some of his stuff, and it just is not adding up to, it's like, why don't you acknowledge the land covenant that God made with Abraham for the Jewish people through Isaac? Do you know what this guy's reply was? He was smart enough to know that he theologically couldn't argue that. He said to me in writing, in an email, I just don't agree with that. You don't agree with it? Well, that's not an answer. That's not even a position. That's your emotion taking over. He was admitting, I can't refute this scripturally. I'm just telling you, I just don't like the Israelis.
Right.
You know? Yeah. And so that kind of thing came into the American church in the early 2000s to the mid 2000s. It really intensified. And keep in mind, look, whether you like these guys or not overall, I'm just saying that as long as Jerry Falwell and Adrian Rogers and people like that were in positions of power in the evangelical world, Israel had a good ally in the American church. Those guys died. Guess who fills the vacuum?
Right.
It's the next generation of evangelical leaders who I can document are left wing. A sizable number of them are left wing. It's there if people want to see it. And so now you've got guys like Russell Moore coming into the Southern Baptist Convention. He's now managing editor of Christianity Today, putting all this left-wing ideology into the church.
Right.
That's what happened. And American church support for Israel began to slide then, and it's gotten worse since then.
And this is the unfortunate truth that most people don't even want to touch. There's no room, there's no space for guys like Russell Moore and those like him, if not for the fact that most pastors and certainly the congregations are biblically illiterate. They spend no time in the Old Testament, so they don't even know the prophecies about God regathering the people. So they don't even have a clue that the Bible is so clear about this. But they'll argue against it until they're blue in the face. But they only do it on emotion and whatever they may have been told, but they'll never look to the text themselves. So that's an indictment on the church as a whole. kind of frustrating. Before we move on, it's just so funny. I might even try to put it up and put it in part of this this video. But it's this great picture, and you see him all the time, of Jesus being surrounded by people like he's having a conversation with them. One of the people asks him, says, "Jesus, are you a Palestinian?" And his reply is, "A what?" So
Exactly.
that's what it ought, that's how we ought to be taking on this whole thing. Let's deal with one thing before we go on, because it's something that we hear all the time. There's two parts to this. First of all, that they are this is just, the irony is amazing. People that are claiming that they're part of the church are complaining about the quote genocide that's happening to the Palestinian people by the Jews. And of course, they're using the money that's or the numbers rather that are presented to them by the Hamas Health Ministry as to who's died and all the rest of it. But I'm not sure what the updated numbers were, but they were somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000, if we can believe them, not even taking into account that most of them are terrorists anyways, out of a population that was very close to 2 million at the time. So do you want to address the whole genocide thing and the ridiculousness of that, when a
Yeah.
real genocide actually was attempted against the Jews in World War II?
Yeah. But as I get into that, let me say up front what the problem is with all this is you can share this information with people and you can point out the obvious to them. For example, they're torturing the hostages right up to the moment of their release. Okay, the hostages are emaciated and look like Holocaust survivors. The terrorists are fat. They're all fat. They're eating very well. There's no genocide in Gaza, but the problem is people don't want to believe Israel's side.
Right.
They're already Jew haters. And as I said before, there's too many of them in the American church, in the pews, in the pulpits, in the seminaries. The seminaries have been compromised for 100 years. And now the fruits of all that are finally coming out. So the charge of genocide, that's straight out of Joseph Goebbels' playbook in the Nazis in World War II. Tell a lie big enough and enough times and people will believe it. And as I said, you already have the advantage. If you're pushing pro-Palestinian propaganda, you're already halfway there because people don't like Israel to begin with.
Right.
They're waiting for you to tell them a lie because it promotes their own narrative. And so that was one of the things that Hamas was very, very smart and skilled at. These guys have spent decades studying propaganda and marketing. And if there's no prohibition in your own life to lying, well, you have another huge advantage. You have no restraints.
Right.
In fact, within Islam, there is the concept that you can lie if it advances your agenda.
Yeah.
And so it's their stock and trade.
Right.
Thousands of aid trucks have come in since Hamas attacked Israel. People have prioritized feeding fat Palestinians over getting the hostages out and ending their suffering. This is easily documented. And there was never a genocide. I'll tell you something. If Israel wanted to commit genocide against the Palestinians, on the morning of October 8th, 2023, the Air Force would have flattened the Gaza Strip permanently. Right. And there would be 1.7 million bodies under the rubble. I want to tell you a quick story that illustrates this. In my view, and I love the Israelis, I love the Jews. To paraphrase Will Rogers, I never met a Jew I didn't like. They're wonderful, noble people. But if they have a weakness, they're almost, if I can say it this way, they're almost too moral. They will fight a war and put their own troops in danger to save their enemies. So in 2002, the so-called Second Intifada erupted in Israel. Arafat launched another intifada, meaning violence against the Jews. And so there's two cities in what the world calls the West Bank, Judea Samaria. Jenin and Nablus. They are terror nests for Hamas and have been for 30 years. And so Jenin became so bad. There were so many attacks coming out of there into Israel proper. The IDF had to go in, and the chief of general staff made the decision, we're going to fight house to house because that will save civilians' lives. Several Israeli soldiers were killed in that house-to-house fighting in 2002 to save innocent Palestinian civilians. I visited the graves of those soldiers at Mount Herzl in Jerusalem in 2005. Their graves are there because Israel is so moral that they want to keep civilian casualties at a minimum. Now, look, I'm just telling you what history is. That wasn't the agenda. That wasn't the strategy of the Allies in World War II. And I don't disagree with it because it forced the Nazis and the Japanese to surrender. But, you know, a city like Dresden in Germany, we bombed that thing into a fireball. But it caused the end of the war to happen and the Nazi regime fell. You have to do that in an existential war. Israel, in my humble opinion, should have been able to launch a more intensive war short term in the Gaza Strip. I guarantee you it would have brought Hamas to their knees and to surrender. But again, what was the fly in the ointment? It was Joe Biden and his illegitimate regime and his corrupt advisors that pushed all of that out much farther than it should have been. That's the tragedy of the whole thing. There's no genocide in Gaza. If there was genocide, why are there still 1.7 million Palestinians alive?
Exactly.
And they all look healthy to me.
Yeah.
They're not thin and emaciated like the hostages are.
This is what I wish people understood. And I've been beating this drum along with you from as long as people have been making that accusation. And really, if you're going to hear somebody repeat that, they are just demonstrating their rank ignorance. And I'm with you on this. If they'd have been able to get all the hostages, but still wanted to clear out Hamas, they still wouldn't have just bombed it indiscriminately. It's not in their makeup. It's not how they do what they do. They realize that there are people that they would consider as innocents, yet if you see the polling from there, the people who actually support what's been going on there is pretty appalling. But, you know, be that as it may, people are going to have their opinions and all that stuff. But I think people need to pick up a dictionary if they're going to start using terms, because that one was just one of the most ridiculous things and it's been repeated so often. And we still see it now. But again, we started seeing a lot of the protests happening here in the country. And I find that interesting, too, that the same, quote, pro-Palestinian protests that we were seeing here in the college campuses and all the rest of it, now that Biden's not in play anymore, and I understand it's winter time in much of the country, but in the places where it's nice weather, we're not seeing those same kind of protests the same way that we did before.
There was one just yesterday I read about, and it was an American Jewish guy, you know, going out to get coffee in one of the cities, and he sees some of these goofy students protesting with the Palestinian flag, and which, by the way, the Palestinian flag is just created out of thin air. It's the Jordanian flag with the star taken out.
Right.
So anyway. And they've got their posters and the propaganda, the genocide and all this kind of stuff. And this guy goes up to this one student and he starts, you know, just questioning him about a couple of things. And he said, have you ever been over there? No. Well, do you know about the terror operations in Jenin and Nablus? The guy didn't even know what Jenin and Nablus was.
Of course.
They know nothing. It's I think it was Rush Limbaugh that called people like this know-nothings. They don't know anything. Now, one thing that's coming out, though, especially with this USAID stuff, these people, this isn't just organic demonstrations. None of them are organic. They're all paid.
Right.
You know, you're taking you know, 18th century Russian literature as a major at Columbia, and you know, living with your parents on the weekend or whatever. You don't have a job, and so they're paying these guys $100 to go out and stand on the street corner and shout out their Jew hatred.
Yeah.
There's nothing behind it. It's all fabricated.
You know, we were in Jerusalem the time in 23 when the quote riots were happening, and I know you and I have talked about this, but it was really frustrating to read the press here, and even some biblical commentators, some people that pay attention to this stuff. We were actually in the city of Jerusalem and drove through Tel Aviv the following day when they were showing all the images of fireballs in the street and people protesting and all the rest of it. That very same night, we were at our hotel, the Dan Panorama on the west side of the city, and we're walking up the street to go to Ben Yehuda Street, which is the kind of nice little hangout place. And Jim, it was one of the most surreal things I've ever witnessed, that there is this horde of hundreds, if not thousands of people walking in our direction. And it was clearly one of those big protests. So we're walking down the right-hand side of the street, and they're on the left, and they're dominating the sidewalks, the streets, and everything else. But the police on horseback were making sure that people would be able to walk past them on our side of the street. They were very, very good about controlling the group because they don't put up with the stupidity that we do here. But I guarantee you, if people were to look at the pictures that I took of it and compare it to anything that you see here in this country as far as protests against the government, from the wearing of the pink hats to the gay pride flags, all the rest of it, stuff that doesn't even seem to have anything to do with what they were protesting, you could tell that if not even just the mentality, maybe even some of the same people are here, and it looks identical. And it just shows that you can rent a mob wherever you want to, and they're just going to kind of sing out of the same hymnal. It looked identical to what you see here in the country. And I couldn't stop laughing, but I just realized how pathetic these people were. And yet, unlike here in this country, sometimes you wouldn't want to be real close to it because you don't know what's likely to happen. We walked right past them, and all we could have was just a kind of a sadness that these people are so horribly deceived. But never did we feel threatened because they have it under control. It was just such an interesting contrast, but at the same time, a reminder that these people just kind of travel in circles.
Well, I remember that week, the day that you sent me photos from Tel Aviv, and you were making that point because I was asking you, well, I'm hearing here in the media about all the violence and stuff. No, that wasn't the case. And I went later that year, and I had a little bit of the same experience. I was sitting on the balcony of my hotel on the beach in Tel Aviv. And now that was the week when Hamas fired a lot of rockets over. But this particular morning, I'm sitting there, one of those great Israeli breakfasts, and I'm reading the newspaper. And then I was looking at my computer, and there was a graphic showing essentially that Tel Aviv was on fire. This was a British paper reporting this. There was red dots covered Tel Aviv. I'm sitting in Tel Aviv. I'm looking down at the beach. People were riding bikes. They were swimming. They were fishing. They were playing volleyball. There was none of the chaos, but they wanted to push the narrative that Israel is under siege and blah, blah, blah. And when you do that, you bolster terrorist groups like Hamas. You make them look stronger than they are. And so it's just all, nowadays, and I talk to people like this all the time, you have to be very careful about filtering out news that you're getting.
Yeah.
You have to have critical thinking skills and think through this. Is what I'm hearing true? And I think that you can kind of come to what is really going on, but it's very, very difficult because of the propaganda of the media is widespread.
That's the sad part of it, because I even heard people who live there, some recognizable people in Christian circles that are always talking about prophecy, that were saying, I don't know if I'm going to have to relocate and get my family out of here. And I'm thinking, these are people who aren't even really right there. Man, we were in the thick of it. We were in Jerusalem, and that was the day that later on in the day, our group, it was the day before, our group, the major part of it, we stayed some days after, they went home the day that they shut down the airport. Now you hear the reporting of it and you're thinking torches and pitchforks that they marched on the airport. It was a planned strike that lasted a half a day. And of course, they show all the protests and all that stuff. And the following day, after we had walked through the mob and had dinner, that was when we decided to go up to Haifa, Herzliya, those places up along the coast. And we spent a few days on the coast. We drove right through Tel Aviv, and I actually recorded it. I said, here's your civil war. And I was taking pictures of the overpasses in Tel Aviv. There was nothing. There was not even very much in the way of signage, of protests, because this is when Bibi was saying, hey, the government here on the judiciary side has way too much power, and they had wanted to put in reforms. That's what it was about. And it was just, the reporting on it was just absolutely insane. But, again, it's kind of the way of propaganda, the way that propaganda works. It just was effective for what they wanted done. But it's frustrating to see when people on our side of it fall for the hysteria, and it just prolonged everything. So,
the media in Israel is left wing, just like it is here.
right.
It's the same exact people.
Yeah.
They'll travel in the same circles.
Yeah, you have the Never Trumpers here. You have the Never Bibis there. They're just carbon copies of one another. That was obvious when we were there, and nothing that they were proposing to do was in any ways radical. But like what you're seeing with the belly aching that's happening among the left here, when you start to take away their potential for power, in this case, money here, they're having a say in how even a prime minister can run his government, has to be approved by the courts. It's time that you do something about it. But the people that are going to complain are the ones whose power is being challenged. So just so typical and sad. But when we fast forward to what's happened now, and we saw some real change in just, I don't even want to call it hyperbole, but just the things that were being said once Trump won the presidency, before he took office, but in that interval of time from November to January, the whole landscape over there and how it was being discussed about the future going forward really began to change dramatically. So let's go ahead and let's tackle that.
Yeah, I mean, all of us in this country, for a unlimited number of reasons, was just waiting to crawl across the finish line with Biden, just counting the days and minutes. And so as that approached, everybody realized that there was going to be a paradigm shift with Trump taking power. And there was, obviously. And so, it's pretty rare to have a good president in power at the same time Israel has a good prime minister who's a Zionist. And now, that's come to be. And so the whole approach to this Hamas war has shifted. And do you want me to talk about the last week of what Trump has?
Yeah, let's get to it. That's going to
Yeah.
definitely be, everybody's talking about it.
And I'm like everybody else. I had no clue that a seismic shift was coming in the thinking, because in Washington and in Europe, all the diplomacy always moves like a glacier. It doesn't change from decade to decade. It's just the same stuff. The U.S. State Department until 3 weeks ago was exactly what it was in 1947. Pro-Arab, all this kind of stuff. So, nothing was going to change. And so since 1991, when I believe the Oslo Accords started, that was the beginning of the two-state solution that Western diplomats came up with. They cleaned up the PLO. They made them take a bath, put suits on them. They brought them to the negotiating table. And all of a sudden, they're statesmen. They're terrorists. But that fantasy started then, and that's when the real pressure started on Israel, because the two-state solution says that there must be a state, a territory carved out of Israel today. And you've seen the map many times. You've been there many times. You can drive from Tel Aviv, the airport, and reach the Jordan River in an hour. It's just a tiny country. They wanted to cut that in half and give to the Palestinian Arabs. Well, that was offered for 30 years, and nobody ever, there was never any stoppage of that. It was always a stupid model for how to solve this conflict. The way to solve the conflict is what Trump proposed this week, I was as stunned as anybody on the planet when the guy is standing there at the podium having that press conference with Netanyahu in Washington, and Trump just says, we're going to move the Palestinians out of Gaza.
Right.
And somebody's going to take them. You know, Indonesia was offered, was raised as a possibility. Now, this is just an aside. If you stick 1.7 million radicalized Palestinians in Indonesia, East Asia is now in peril.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But now it's being talked. Trump is putting pressure on Egypt and Jordan to take all of the Palestinian population of Gaza. They're talking about moving them out.
Yeah.
Prior to this week, the only people, and they were a handful, were they wanted that model. They said this is the only real solution. It's the exact same concept, and I'm wondering if this is going on too in the West Bank, because Israel launched a major operation a couple of weeks ago. I think they're preparing that because there's rumors that Trump will support Israel annexing Judea, Samaria. That would be as big a seismic shift as the Gaza proposal. I believe 100% that the Gazans are going to leave Gaza. They're out of there either voluntarily or they're going to force them to. And I wouldn't be surprised if they go to at least one Arab state. Jordan can say, we don't want him. We're not taking him. Egypt says, we're not taking him. We're not listening to Trump. We'll cut off the $5 billion we give them annually.
Yep.
They don't have a military anymore.
Right.
They're going to do what Trump says. So that proposal is so stunning, but it is the answer.
Right.
You have to move them out of there. They have been radicalized for 80 years, a steady diet of strong men, terrorists, raising them on hate and incitement to violence against Jews. It's just what they do. It's the only thing they do. And so moving them out of there is absolutely incredible. I'll just finish with this. Like I said, there's only been a handful of people that would propose that, and until this week, they were considered to be crazy radicals. One was Zev Jabotinsky, the Russian Jew who helped create conditions for the state of Israel. He died before the state was established, but Jabotinsky was like, look, we need an army. These people hate us. They've hated us for generations. We're going to have to defend ourselves if we're going to settle Palestine and be a state. Jabotinsky knew what was going on. Meir Kahane, a New York rabbi who was vilified by everybody until this week, Kahane was saying the same thing 50 years ago, but he was presented as some crazy lunatic who wasn't a humanitarian. No, Kahane was realistic. And then finally, the third one that I know of, I knew him, Benny Alon, who was a member of the Knesset in Israel. Alon, kind of the same thing. He goes, look, we're not going to solve this so long as these people are living in the middle of us. They're going to have to go somewhere else. Well, guess what? Jabotinsky, Kahane, Alon, they were right. And all of Western diplomacy was profoundly wrong. And so that's brought us to this moment where it takes a transformational figure like Donald Trump, who has the power to raise such a proposal and see it through. Right. And so where it goes from there, of course, nobody can predict. This is all still too new. But I'm telling you, Trump's proposal is the right answer.
And it's just obvious. I mean, it really shouldn't be controversial. But I was rewatching an interview that Steve Bannon did back in 2019 with Frontline, and he was talking about what they did at Breitbart, and you could tell that this is also the way that Trump operates. It's like you say something that is to the right audience is just totally incendiary, and it makes them completely nuts.
Not to interrupt, but Frontline must have clutched their pearls when they heard that.
If you've watched it, it is oh my gosh, it is masterclass Steve Bannon, and just saying everything that would hack off every leftist in the territory. It was beautiful. If you haven't had a chance to go see it, the Frontline interview that he did back in 2019, it's brilliant. And if you don't have it, I'll give you a link to it. It was so fun. But anyhow, he basically said that we figure that there's about three or four things that we can throw out all at once, and the media is going to grab onto one of them, and it's going to be like the dog proverbially chasing its tail in the middle of the room. And so you get them all spun up and they're doing all their things, and you move on to the next thing. When I heard Trump say that, there was a few things that went through in my head. I'm thinking it's not going to take but a few moments for people to start with the Trump is the Antichrist. He's going to divide the land, and you're getting all that same kind of nonsense. But me, I'm thinking I can't wait to hear what some of the other people in the administration start to say to add some color to this. So give it a couple of days, and we're going to find out what he's talking about. So it went from we're going to take over Gaza as though it's a unilateral thing and there's nobody's going to be able to question it, to where Trump ends up saying, well, first of all, the people that are displaced now are going to continue to be displaced. There's no place for them to live. The place is booby trapped. And in order to try to rebuild it, you've got to get rid of all of that stuff, unexploded ordnance, you name it, it's there, and it's perilous before you can even start to clear the place out. But in order to do that, the people can't be there. There's no place for them to be. That ended up being said, which is like, well, duh, that's obvious. It should be. The other thing that was subliminal in this, and many people didn't pick up on it, it was a very obvious signal that there is no place for Hamas going forward, though he never had to say it. And the third part of it, and other people in the administration said, we'll bring in private industry who would want to come and help to develop this. We were hearing about, well, I thought he wasn't an interventionist. Why are they going to put the military in there? He never said that they would. They jumped to that conclusion. So his whole point is, again, subliminally, there's no place for Hamas. We're going to make sure that Israel's able to do what it needs to do. That's why we've given them the munitions that have been held up by the Bidens, all the way down to bulldozers to finish the job, and then ultimately clean the slate of all the people that are there so that they can get to work. And I've heard some people say, when you listen to the people who know development and what's happened with all of the tunneling that's there that undermines the buildings and all the stuff, the infrastructure for war that Hamas put in place, they're saying it's years before you could even begin to try to build this. And the idea of trying to have something Gaza where it's the quote Riviera of the Mediterranean, or the Riviera of however he put it, that's more than a decade away before that could happen. But people just, they kind of latched on that Trump said, we're going to take over Gaza. That's all that they needed to hear. And they go running with it and make all kinds of absurd, just hair on fire, chicken little chasing their tail kinds of assumptions on the whole thing, when that was not what he said. But it reminded me of what Bannon had said. You go ahead and get people working themselves up into a lather over this at CNN, MSNBC, and all the other, alphabet soup types, and they're going to move on to the next two or three things. They've got their whole planned out step by step. They know what they're going to do.
Well, I think the most important takeaway from Trump's proposal is, again, you're right, all the pearl clutching of everybody that's criticizing it, and they're committing genocide, it's population transfer, it's all this terrible stuff. None of that matters for one reason. Trump is imposing his will on the world, and he's going to impose his will on the Palestinians and on Hamas, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Right.
So this'll get done. I'm glad you mentioned the thing about the cleanup there, because that's something I didn't think about either until about 2 months ago. I was reading a piece in this analysis, and this guy said the same thing. He goes, wait a second. The destruction is so bad there that it would take 15 years to clean it all up. Now, once you clean it up, maybe it takes 5 years, to get the Riviera hotels there. I think that'll probably happen. In fact, I'm just going to say right now, I'm going to plan to smoke a cigar on the beach in Gaza in 2045,
Jim, if we're here in 2045, I'm going to be a depressed man. I'm going to be very sad.
True. A lot of prophecy people don't think we'll be here anywhere near that close. But it's, he's the first one probably ever to come up with a realistic solution for all this stuff. Because, and this is something I thought about too, and we mentioned right at the start, like everything else, it all goes back to Scripture. What you see in the Bible is what you see in the real world. Scripture always has the wisdom. And in Genesis chapter 16, where Ishmael, we first hear about Ishmael, the son of Abram and Hagar, the Egyptian. It says in there that Ishmael, this is a prophecy, Ishmael will grow up to be a wild donkey of a man that nobody can contend with. Hello, what are the Arabs of that region today?
Yep. He'll be in a constant state of war.
Constant state of war. They almost can't do anything else. It's in their nature. It's in their DNA. And so people do, they ask me all the time, why are they that way? Because of what God said in Genesis.
Right.
That's their forefather. They're intractable because it's just in them. And so anyway, for Trump to come up with a landmark proposal like this is absolutely staggering.
Yep.
And I'm glad, frankly, because, and I say this all the time, the thing is, I identify as a Christian Zionist. I support the Jewish people worldwide.
Yep.
I have many Israeli friends. I have many Jewish friends. If I am forced to choose, I only care about the Jews. I only care about Israel. I don't care if the Palestinians in Gaza didn't get Twinkies in this shipment of aid. I don't care if they didn't get a new mattress or whatever. I care about stopping murder of Jews, period. That'll always be the only priority for me in this. And if it takes a radical proposal from a maverick president, I'm all for it.
Well, that seemed to be the first shoe to drop, because then, wouldn't you have loved to have been a fly on the wall when they met together and just listened to what they had to say? Because I have a feeling that what we're seeing rolling out even today, which will address something that I sent to you right before we started to record, people love to think of Trump as just this complete loose cannon that whatever's on his mind is the first thing he says, and he doesn't deliberate through these things. And I think that's all done that way to keep people completely off balance. But I believe, especially when it comes to the Gaza stuff, this is all thought out, and there's no way that Bibi was blindsided by any of this. So I remember saying this just yesterday to someone when Trump had mentioned about, Hamas has until Saturday noon to release the hostages. And he said, but of course, Israel has the right to go ahead and supersede that. They can do what they want to do. And I said to them, there's no way he comes out and says that and Bibi was unaware of it. They had that discussion when they met together in Washington. There's no doubt in my mind. And then today, right before you and I got on this recording, Netanyahu reinforced that there's going to be an end to the ceasefire, and we're going to go back to a very, very warlike, we're coming back in to pick up where we left off if you don't have the hostages back. So it's kind of Trump started this whole thing. Bibi gets to come in behind him and says, we're in agreement on this, and this is going to happen. So what happens by Saturday? I mean, that's you and me, as we're looking at this, we're going, holy mackerel, what's going to be next? Because that is a line in the sand. And unlike the last administration or Obama before him with the Syrians and the red line and all that, when he puts a line in the sand, you kind of expect he's going to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. It goes back to Biden's don't, and then Putin invades Ukraine. When Trump says don't and you do, you're going to die.
Yeah.
And they're going to do what they say they're going to do. And when Netanyahu was here this week, he didn't just meet with Trump. He met with Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense.
Yep.
He met with Steve Waltz, National Security Advisor.
Right.
That wasn't just, having coffee.
Yeah.
They came up with a plan.
Strategy.
And Netanyahu came here with an operational plan that he's coordinating with the Americans. This time, the difference is the Americans are on his side as well. And so I have no doubt that Saturday noon means Saturday noon. So Saturday at noon, I'm gonna, which is what? That's 4 o'clock in the morning for you and I, you know? So early morning here on Saturday, something's going down. And I, I'm speculating like everybody else. I don't have any inside information. I don't think Hamas is going to budge. They're a death cult. They're true believers in that they are going to die for Allah. So they're not, the Soviets weren't irrational. They were evil, but they weren't irrational. The Hamas is in Islamic Jihad, all the rest of them, they're irrational. And
Right.
so I don't think we can count on them making the right decision in this. And so Trump is going to go in and back up what he said he's going to do.
Right. Well, it's going to be interesting to watch because what's going to ultimately happen, can you imagine, as you say, if they don't do the release and it really creates, this is not one of those ambiguous things that they said, we'll do this. And you could look at it and say, well, that could mean this or it could mean that. It's like, you don't do this, we're coming in. There's no way to really back that down. So at that point, you would say, does Israel then turn their focus and say, all right, we're coming back in. It's going to be different this time. The people who, this is where you get to those other countries. You better start taking these refugees. You start vetting them. We're going to move them to the south. All the people that went back into the north are coming back, and you start funneling them through Egypt. And yeah, so we won't give you any of your money, or pay $6 million so you can support your tourism. That's that USAID thing. So anyhow, they basically could say it's time to funnel out the civilians because we're coming in and we're finishing the job. And if it means that this ends up leading to the deaths of any of the hostages from this point forward, again, how do you say it's going to be life for life here of all of your leadership more so than it was before? How they're going to do it from this point on is really anybody's guess. But this time it seems like enough of the silliness of just handing a few people over here and there. You've played this card long enough. Now with an administration that is not going to be willing to play the game for them, now you have them on the same page. Us and Israel are singing the same tune.
Yeah, and you even have this interesting situation where individual Palestinians are risking their lives by making videos in Gaza saying, "Please, Mr. Trump, I'm ready to walk out of here today. I'll go. I'll leave." They're looking for a place to go. They're looking for an escape route to take. I suspect there's a healthy majority of the Palestinians probably want to do what Trump is proposing. So that's the thing. If you ask Western media, which is morally corrupt and stupid, it's all, oh, that's genocide and it's
Yeah.
population transfer and that's evil. Oh, the people living over there in rubble. Okay, you're going to build me housing in Jordan? Yeah, okay, I'll go.
Mm-hmm.
They're ready to go, which is going to leave Hamas pretty much marginalized, I think, for the first time, which will make Israel's job theoretically easier. But I'm like you, whatever happens, I don't know exactly operationally how it's going to happen. I am certain that the Americans and the Israelis have coordinated an operational plan that is going to work, and I think one that will surprise Hamas.
Well, you know this, that there's probably not any group on the planet better at intelligence than Israel, and those hostages being released have given them obviously a wealth of information, and they're very good at executing those kinds of things. When they put a plan in, it's well done.
And I think the unfortunate reality is that most people are starting to wise up to is uh, I think there's not more than a handful of hostages that are alive. I think Israel is aware. I think they know who is dead and alive. It came out about a month ago that they had known the prior 3 months where the majority of them were being kept. They just couldn't get to them because the terrorists would have killed them immediately. So I think there's a lot more intelligence that we aren't aware of that tells them the
Right.
condition of the hostages. And this sounds very harsh. I don't mean it this way at all. I wish all the hostages had been released alive. But this time, I think at least operationally, the hostages aren't going to be the first priority. The first priority is going to be what it should have been October 8th, 2023.
Right.
Go in and completely eradicate all of Hamas. And I think that's finally is the situation there and what should have been a long time ago.
Well, it's been an interesting last year because, pretty much all the upper leadership of both Hamas, and we haven't talked much about Hezbollah up in the north with Lebanon, but most of their top dogs are long since gone on to their reward. And I just think that if that's the same thing, if you want to try to take that big position, the Babylon Bee ran an article of this kid that looks like he's just graduated from Cornell, wearing a keffiyeh, talking about how he was so excited to have been promoted so quickly in Hezbollah that just last week he was like working at Dairy Queen, and this week he's one of the leaders in Hezbollah because there's nobody else.
I'm taking over for Sheikh Nasrallah now, so
yeah,
I'm 21 years old. I'm from Yonkers, New York.
Yeah, it's man, if you could have said a year ago, if you and I had this conversation, can you imagine a world in which all the upper leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah are gone and their infrastructure is completely decimated? You and I have had this conversation before. The Nazis were not eradicated in World War II. They were just defeated and rendered impotent to do what they wanted to do. So you're never going to be able to get rid of the ideology of Islam and radicalism. You can't get rid of it. You just got to make it where they don't have the ability to make war. And Israel's done a very competent job at that. What ends up happening in Lebanon is anybody's guess, but they've accomplished what they needed to there. And there is no future for Gaza as it's been since they left it, unfortunately, as they did, 18 years ago, 19 years ago. From that moment that they started doing it, that infrastructure to make war and the tunneling and all that stuff they started day one with that. You and I both know it. And this time around, Israel doesn't have to apologize for saying, we can't let them back in because they'll start all over again. We're just not going to have that be the possibility. So there's no future for Gaza as it has been traditionally. And like you said, fortunately in Trump, they're not going to get anybody that's going to try to capitulate on that or try to make excuses for the way that things were. It's just, there's not a scenario in this world where that happens.
No, there's not. And, Israel has degraded Hamas down to almost nothing. As you mentioned, good summary on Hezbollah, the same situation. Remember for years, the worry from everybody was, well, they've got a stockpile of 300,000 rockets and missiles, and they're going to overwhelm Israel, right. Send them all over. Well, guess what? They've degraded that by 90%, the right. Israelis. Iran took out their air defense system.
Yeah.
And now, what did we hear the other day? The U.S. has released 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to Israel. You know what that means? There's going to be a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. And so, but the point I want to make, and I'm glad you brought this up, this is another aspect of this whole thing. And most people don't know this because, again, they don't read Scripture. But in a way, we shouldn't be surprised by these successes on the battlefield by Israel, because God has promised, he's really staked his reputation on it, if I can say it that way. He's going to preserve the Jews forever.
Yep. And
he said repeatedly in the Old Testament, again, Amos 9:15, read it. When I bring you back for the last time, you're never going to be uprooted again. Israel is not going anywhere. They're eternal. God promised it. He promised it on his holy name. And so
right.
we I didn't know what in the world Israel was ever going to do about Hezbollah's rocket stockpile. Wow, that's scary. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can read history and I see where God delivered them miraculously. I'll just say this real quick. You mentioned this at the beginning. I'm glad you did. Latrun, the site of a famous battle in Israel's War of Independence in 48-49, where the Israelis, the new Israel Defense Forces, fought the Arabs, the Jordanians. And when I was there last, and you've been there too, you can stand on top of the old police headquarters building there. And if you look to the east, you are looking at the Valley of Ayalon.
Mhm.
And this is really key. And I wish more people could understand this. You could find God by thinking this through. Here is Latrun, where they were able to, the Israelis able to hang on by their fingernails, and they won the war. And Latrun, Ariel Sharon, the later the prime minister and the general, fought at Latrun. The Israelis had miraculous victories in that war that can't be explained apart from the supernatural.
Right.
So you're looking across at the Valley of Ayalon, this vast, beautiful valley. That's where Joshua fought the Amorites. And Joshua's long day,
Yeah.
he asked God for extra daylight. People waste time saying, "Oh, naturally, how could that have happened?" And what are you talking about? The
Right.
physics of it. I don't care about that.
Right.
I care that the Bible says God did it. He saved Israel that day against their mortal enemy. They routed that enemy because they were led by Joshua, who believed God's word. And so, to take it back, standing there and looking at this scene, understanding that the past is connected to the present and the future, it's all the same thing. In Israel, the past, present, and future are always swirling together constantly. It's all the same stuff.
Right.
The message is God keeps his promises to his people, and that's what is happening now. And so just sit back and watch.
I love that. And yeah, see, you and I are kind of like separated at birth, my friend. The idea that people would say, gosh, do you realize what would happen, the cataclysmic effect that would have on the earth if God stopped it from spinning or stopped the sun in the sky? Like you say, the physics behind it, it really gives a good indication of how much they really understand the nature of God. Because are you telling me that he's somehow governed by his creation? Who made physics, for crying out loud? He made physics. It obeys him, not the other way around. So I just wish people really fully grasp this. And once again, this just goes back to, do we take the literal view of what scripture has to say? And if it says something and it hasn't happened yet, then that means that the timing's not right. But the outcome is really not in question. And if people don't know what we do, I know that because of the title of what we're going to have in this, and because of the topic, we might get viewers that are not familiar with any of this. But right now, I'm going through on our New Testament studies on Mondays. I'm going through the book of Revelation, and I defy anybody after chapter 3 to read the book of Revelation and not notice how decidedly Jewish it is. It is absolutely focused on Israel and the Jewish people and what happens on the earth as God judges the world. But where is the culmination of all things? It happens in the land that we call Israel, a very, very small place. And if you go with us in October, you'll get a chance to see just how small that place is, and how all of this world history could come to a conclusion in that place is just mind-boggling in the extreme.
The replacement theology people and others that oppose Israel in the church and don't like Jews, please explain to me why in the New Jerusalem the foundation stones and the doors on the gates have Jewish names. The apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel. God is not finished with the Jewish people. He's not finished with Israel, and he never will be.
Sure. And show me, actually going along lines with that, there's only one group of people in the entirety of the tribulation that are off limits for any kind of violence or death. And that happens to be 144,000 young men or men that are representative of the tribes. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes, 144,000 males. And nothing can be done to them. They are bulletproof, basically. So again, explain that. They're not Gentiles, they're not women, they're not trans, they're not any of those things. They are just virgin men of the tribes of Israel. So again, tell me how that's a Gentile. Tell me that's how that's a church matter. It isn't. It has nothing to do with it.
Amen.
Jim, anything else you'd like to cover?
I don't think so. This has been good. I think we covered a lot of stuff, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we'll have to do it as things are going to happen in the next few weeks. Maybe we get on and do a follow-up to this, but I thought it would be a good thing to kind of take it from beginning to end of explaining what's been going on. Why don't you tell people about your ministry and tell them what you're doing with that and how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I've started what's called a Patreon page. So it's patreon.com/ the God that answers. And my whole purpose is I call it teaching Bible prophecy in a different way or a new way. I don't focus a lot on who the Antichrist is and that kind of thing. I focus on prophecies already fulfilled, which clearly point us to a sovereign God. And so if God is in control of history, if he's in control of the future, he's also in control of your future.
Right.
And so we understand then the sovereignty of God is all important. And so that's what I do. I do articles and that kind of thing. So people can find me there.
Wonderful. Well, we go to Israel. Again, I've mentioned it a few times. You can contact me through the ministry, oldpaththeology.net. And I have all the information about the trip. The importance of that is that every day that you look at what we will see with our own eyes is a perfect reminder of what Jim's ministry is all about. That God tells you what he'll do in advance. And once he has laid out what he's going to do, it's a matter of when and not if. And that's the thing that's very important for us to grasp onto. And you get a reminder of it every day that when you look around, that God's made good on a promise to restore his people to the land, as he said that he would. So that's why, the same way that you had said it, I'll reestablish this, that the people of Israel, the Jewish people and that land is an eternal promise. So they're going nowhere. And even if they were to be displaced yet again, he would still have to bring them back eventually. So I don't care how many times people could think that they could be removed from the land, they will ultimately be make it back there. Let's do one other thing that I forgot to get to, because I think it's hugely important. We have the people that love to point out the fact that the people who are living there now really aren't any kind of a supernatural work of God, because, and they mentioned the Rockefellers and the globalists, they wanted to bring them back, and they say that the Jews are really just usurpers. It's nothing that is supernatural.
Well, it all comes down to the fact that, as I said 1,000 times in Scripture, God promises that after a long exile, after the Jews are expelled from the land in antiquity, and he says it's going to be a long time, but I'm going to bring you back again, bring you back for a final time. The issue is this: there are 7 million ethnic Jews that have come back from every country in the world in the last 100 years, and they're now citizens of the state of Israel. Try to explain that away if you want and throw out all that noise all you want. The fact is, millions of ethnic Jews have come back to their ancestral land, and they're there as a sovereign state. That's the whole story.
Love it. And I'll end with this along those lines. For the people that would say the Rockefellers, the United Nations, Israel's not following God, so how can they be a supernatural work of his hands? I will just point to the fact that we have biblical precedent for exactly this same thing. When the Babylonian captivity took place and his people were displaced by Nebuchadnezzar, during that 70 years, which we know why that is from the end of Second Chronicles, it was for every cycle that they did not give the land rest. For 70 cycles, they did not let the land rest. So that's when God said, it's going to be 70 years, you're going to be displaced. And then I will bring you back. Nowhere does he say, I'm going to bring you back because you get your act together. I'm going to bring you back because the time is what I said it is. And then the second part of that is that he used Cyrus, the Persian king, who ended up defeating the Babylonians. It was during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, and Cyrus the king bankrolled sending back the people, many in unbelief, sent them back to their land. So for the people that would want to say, oh, the Rockefellers and the nation of Israel is not walking with God, as though this is something that's unique, get a grip and pick up a Bible and read what happened when he started to bring them back from Zerubbabel into Ezra and then Nehemiah. They came back because God said he was going to reestablish them in hopes that they would get their act together. Of course, he knew what would happen. And even the getting their act together as they did through Ezra and then Nehemiah, was a very short-lived thing. Read the book of Malachi and you'll understand. Uh, it's a history of ups and downs and walking with God and rejecting him, and yet God was still faithful to them even when they were not faithful to him. So that's what we're seeing here. There's going to be a great toll that's going to be taken on those people, and there will be a great revival, but it'll happen among the Jews at great cost, like we've never seen before in this world's history. But to think that somehow God would only restore them to the land because they started walking with him, and it would be, anything other than what we see in our current world, it's not without precedent. Just realize that God has a very established track record of doing the things that he does. And don't believe the nonsense that you read on people's blogs. Read the Bible for yourself.
Well, I'll say this in conclusion to underscore what you just said. Once again, the Bible has the answer. But one of my mentors, Henry Morris, wrote a book called The Bible Has the Answer, and it does. And so there's even an answer to that. And I've heard that a lot. I've heard Christians say, well, you know what? Israel, they're a non-believing country. Those people don't believe in God. I beg to differ. First of all, Ezekiel 37, God very clearly states, he showed the prophet Ezekiel what was going to happen. And he said, in essence, I'm going to bring your people back first physically to the land in the last days. In the second and final stage is their spiritual restoration. I know for a fact the people there are in that restoration right now. You can walk through the old city in Jerusalem. There are posters that say Messiah is coming. It's crystal clear. So again, Scripture is plain. First, the physical restoration, then the spiritual restoration. They are in that process right now. And the thing is, anybody can see it for themselves if they want to.
There, you said it. I couldn't have ended it any better. So, Jim, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you doing this with me. It's always a pleasure, and it's always really good to talk to somebody of like mind. And then, of course, to try to unpack all of this stuff for people that may not understand what's going on there. So I would really strongly recommend people go check out what Jim's got that he's doing there. We're going to have the comment section open in the YouTube of this. You can contact either one of us through our ministry websites, and there's email that you can send to us. Again, if you have questions about what we shared here, by all means, ask them, because I think that the Bible makes it very clear. It helps us to be able to come to a determination of how we think things are going to work out based upon what the Bible already says. So that, again, knowing the outcome, ultimately what it's going to be, really kind of helps you through the day-to-day of things here and there. So Jim, once again, thank you, my brother. It's great to be with you once again on something like this, and we'll do this again real soon.
Thanks, my friend.